Every week, we open files that were never meant to be seen. Classified documents, secret testimonies, the side of history no one told you. If that's what you're here for, subscribe to Declassified. And if this changed how you see history, leave a like. The files are open. Let's go.
It was the spring of 1945, and a Navy lieutenant named Raymond Halloran was lying on a concrete floor in Omori prison camp on a small island in Tokyo Bay, listening to the sound of B-29s passing overhead at night. He had been a prisoner for 14 months. He had been shot down over Tokyo on January 27, 1945, during the first high-altitude daylight raid on the Japanese capital, pulled from the wreckage of his burning aircraft by a crowd that beat him until Japanese military police intervened, and transported to a series of holding facilities before arriving at Omori. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He had lost 3 teeth to beatings and 2 more to malnutrition. His feet were permanently damaged from frostbite sustained during the winter months when the camp provided no heating and inadequate clothing. He listened to the B-29s, and he counted them, as he had learned to count them, because counting them was the only form of intelligence available to him, and because the numbers told a story that the guards, who also listened and also counted, understood differently than he did. He was counting hope. They were counting dread. Both groups were counting the same aircraft.
The experience of American prisoners of war in Japanese captivity during the Second World War has been documented extensively in memoir, in military history, and in the legal proceedings of the post-war war crimes trials. What has been documented less completely is the specific intelligence value of what those prisoners observed, recorded, and reported when they were liberated, and the degree to which their testimony shaped decisions that determined how the Pacific War ended and what kind of post-war world emerged from it. The men who survived Japanese prison camps returned with information that had been collected at an enormous personal cost. Observations about Japanese military capability, civilian morale, industrial condition, and psychological state that no other source could have provided with comparable granularity. Some of that information changed specific decisions. Some of it confirmed assessments that strategic planners had already made through other means. And some of it, the portion that dealt not with Japanese military capacity, but with Japanese civilian psychology and the specific way that ordinary Japanese people were processing the approach of defeat, contributed to one of the most consequential debates of the entire war, the debate about whether Japan would surrender before an invasion and what it would take to make that happen.
The conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps varied significantly by location, by the specific command responsible for administration, and by the period of the war in which prisoners were held. The early camps, established in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies in 1942, operated under the assumption that the war would be short and the political embarrassment of poor prisoner treatment would need to be managed. As the war lengthened and Japanese strategic position deteriorated, camp conditions generally worsened, partly because supply chains that had never been robust collapsed under American submarine and air interdiction, and partly because the official Japanese attitude towards surrender and captivity made prisoners a category of human being that the military culture had no coherent framework for treating with consistent humanity. Bushido held that surrender was disgrace. A soldier who had surrendered had, in the most fundamental sense, ceased to exist as a member of the community of honor that the code defined. Prisoners were therefore not simply enemies who had been captured. They were men who had chosen a form of death that Japanese culture considered worse than death. And this framing had practical consequences for how guards and administrators related to the men in their custody.
What the prisoners observed in this environment was paradoxically valuable precisely because of its intimacy. Intelligence collection through aerial photography and signals intercept could tell American planners what was being built and where and at what scale. It could not tell them what the man building it believed about the war, how he talked about it with his colleagues at the end of the shift, whether the official narratives his government provided were still functioning as genuine belief or had been reduced to a performance that everyone maintained because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. The prisoners could observe these things because they were physically present in the environment, because they moved through it under guard and therefore invisibly in the way that supervised people are invisible, and because the Japanese guards and workers and civilians who surrounded them often behaved as if the prisoners were not fully present, speaking in front of them with a candor that a more sophisticated psychological security apparatus might have suppressed. Sergeant Frank Bigelow had been captured on Bataan in April 1942 and spent 3 years in a series of camps in the Philippines and Japan before ending the war at a facility near Nagoya. In his debriefing at the end of the war, conducted by Army intelligence officers who were working through a structured protocol designed to extract maximum operational value from liberated prisoner testimony, Bigelow described observations about the Japanese civilian workforce at the factory adjacent to his camp that his interrogators found immediately significant. He had been assigned to a work detail at the factory beginning in early 1944, one of hundreds of prisoners used as forced labor in Japanese industrial facilities throughout the war. The factory produced aircraft components, and Bigelow, who had worked in a machine shop before the war, understood enough of what he was watching to make informed assessments of what he saw. What he described was not sabotage, which prisoners attempted occasionally, and at enormous personal risk. It was the natural deterioration of a manufacturing system under conditions of resource scarcity and workforce exhaustion. Tool quality was declining. Tolerances that a functioning quality control system would have rejected were being accepted because the alternative was no production at all. Workers who had been cycling through 10-hour shifts in 1944 were working 14-hour shifts by early 1945, and the quality of their work was declining in proportion to their fatigue. Absenteeism, which Bigelow tracked by watching which stations were unmanned at shift changes, had increased measurably over the 18 months he spent on the work detail. He could not provide percentages. He could describe the empty stations. The intelligence officers who received his account had aerial photography showing the factory's output and signals intelligence tracking its shipping. Bigelow's account provided the human texture that those sources could not. The most strategically significant testimony from liberated prisoners concerned Japanese civilian morale and the specific psychological condition of the population as American bombing intensified through the first months of 1945. The strategic bombing survey teams that followed the liberation forces into Japan in September 1945 interviewed thousands of Japanese civilians as part of an effort to assess the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. The prisoner testimony from the spring and summer of 1945, collected in the weeks and months before the formal survey could begin, provided a preliminary picture that shaped how the survey teams framed their questions. Lieutenant Commander John Fitzgerald had been shot down over Japan in March 1945 and held at a camp near Yokohama through the final 5 months of the war. His debriefing, conducted on the hospital ship Benevolence 3 days after his liberation, was one of the most detailed and analytically coherent prisoner testimonies in the Army Intelligence Archive. Fitzgerald described the Japanese civilian population in the spring and summer of 1945 in terms that differed sharply from the picture the Japanese government was projecting through its official communications. He had watched the population around his camp respond to the March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo, which destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. The official response, as transmitted through the camp guards and the newspapers that prisoners were occasionally permitted to see, emphasized sacrifice and determination and the spiritual power that Japan would mobilize against the coming invasion. What Fitzgerald observed in the behavior of the guards and the workers and the civilians visible from the camp perimeter was something different. It was not defeatism in any articulate political sense. Japanese civilians were not saying that Japan had lost or should surrender. What they were doing was quietly preparing for a personal future that did not include the official narrative about the war's outcome, storing food, moving possessions to relatives in rural areas, making the small, practical decisions that people make when they believe their current situation is about to become significantly worse. the official narrative was still being performed. The private preparation underneath it suggested that fewer people believed the performance than were maintaining it. This distinction between performed belief and private assessment was one that American strategic planners needed to understand in order to answer the central question of the final months of the Pacific War. Would Japan surrender before an invasion of the home islands? And if so, what would cause it to do so? The question was not academic. American planners estimating the cost of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu in November 1945 and Honshu in March 1946, were working from casualty projections that ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead, with Japanese civilian and military casualties that would have been catastrophic by any measure. The estimates were driven by the experience of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders had fought to effective extinction rather than surrender. If the home islands were defended with comparable intensity, the arithmetic was clear, and it was terrible. The question was whether the home islands would be defended that way, whether the Japanese civilian population and the Japanese military establishment had arrived at a private assessment of the war's outcome that differed sufficiently from the official position to create space for surrender before the invasion began. The prisoner testimony pointed toward a more complex answer than either the hardest or most optimistic American estimate assumed. Major Gregory Boyington, the Marine Corps ace who had been shot down and captured in January 1944 and who spent 18 months in Japanese captivity before being moved to Omori, described in his debriefing a Japanese military culture that was simultaneously committed to the official narrative of honorable death over surrender and visibly aware that the official narrative was no longer connecting to observable reality. The guards who had beaten prisoners in 1943 for violations of camp regulations were enforcing the same regulations with decreasing violence by 1945, not from humanitarian development, but from a practical assessment that the war was going in a direction that made the future of guard-prisoner relationships worth managing more carefully. This behavioral shift, invisible to aerial photography and impenetrable to signals intelligence, was the kind of observation that only someone physically present in the environment could have made. When Boyington's testimony was combined with Fitzgerald's and with the accounts of the hundreds of other liberated prisoners who were debriefed through August and September 1945, a picture emerged that the strategic bombing survey teams found consistent with their own findings. The Japanese government's ability to sustain the official narrative of resistance and sacrifice was deteriorating faster than its military capacity, and the gap between what the population was being told and what it privately believed was wider than the government could manage without the kind of coercive apparatus that the bombing campaign had degraded. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, were decisions made before the prisoner testimony had been fully collected and analyzed, and the debate about whether they were necessary to end the war without invasion has continued among historians for 80 years without resolution. What the prisoner testimony contributed to that debate, retrospectively, was evidence for the proposition that Japan was closer to surrender in August 1945 than the pre-invasion planning documents had assumed, and that the combination of the atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the Pacific War on August 8th produced a convergence of pressures on the Japanese leadership that made surrender possible in a political environment that had previously made it unthinkable. The prisoners who had watched the guards counting B-29s in the spring had been watching a process that neither they nor the guards fully understood, the process by which a society exhausts the psychological resources that sustain a war effort, and the point at which exhaustion crosses the threshold from endurance into collapse. The men who came home from Japanese camps were changed in ways that the debriefing process was designed to extract, and that the debriefing process was not equipped to address simultaneously. Raymond Halloran, the Navy lieutenant counting B-29s on the floor of Omori, was liberated on August 29, 1945, when American forces landed at the camp. He was 24 years old and weighed 93 pounds. He spent 6 weeks in military hospitals before being returned to the United States. His debriefing lasted 4 days and produced a document of 47 pages that dealt primarily with the observations I have described and touched only briefly on what he had personally experienced. This was the protocol. The intelligence value was in the observations. The experience was personal and would be processed through whatever means the men and their families and their society could eventually provide. Many of them processed it for the rest of their lives. Some of them never fully processed it at all. What the aggregate testimony of American prisoners in Japanese captivity provided to the people responsible for ending the Pacific War was something more specific and more valuable than heroism, though the men had been heroic in the ordinary sense of having endured something most people could not have endured. It was witness. They had been inside the thing that American strategic power was trying to break, and they had watched it breaking from inside. And when they came out, they could describe what breaking looked like from that angle. The empty factory stations and the guards counting aircraft and the food being moved to the countryside and the official narrative maintaining its public performance while private behavior moved quietly in a different direction. That testimony reached the men making decisions about how to end the war at a moment when the decisions were being made, and it told them something that no other source could have told them as directly. The system they were trying to break was already breaking. The only question left was how much breaking it would take, and how much breaking both sides could still absorb before the performance and the private reality finally collapsed into the same moment, and the war could end. Halloran lived until 2016. He was 94 years old. He spent decades speaking at schools and veterans events about what he had seen and survived. And in his later years, he traveled to Japan and met with Japanese veterans and civilians and participated in the ceremonies of reconciliation that both countries had built from the rubble of the thing they had done to each other. He said in one of his last recorded interviews that the Japanese people he had met in those later years were not the people who had built the camp at Omori or beaten him on the streets of Tokyo. They were the people who had been in the camp alongside him, on the other side of the wire, counting the same aircraft and drawing opposite conclusions from the same evidence, and living with those conclusions for the rest of their lives, the same way he was. He said this without bitterness, which may have been the most remarkable thing he ever said. More remarkable than surviving the camp, or counting the aircraft, or enduring the 4 days of debriefing that reduced 14 months of captivity to 47 pages of intelligence. He had understood something that the men who planned the war and the men who ended it had worked very hard to understand through aerial photography and signals intercept and strategic bombing surveys and prisoner testimony. That the people on the other side of any wire are counting the same things you are. They just need them to mean something different.